Hey everybody, it's Derek here. Thanks as always for stopping by. So today, I think it's March 2nd today, I wanted to do a wrap up for February of 2024. It's Black History Month. I stayed pretty faithful to it, and I had a insane month, as you can see here. Try to get the AI to come down lower. There we go. That's my stack, and I want to tell you about it. Okay, so February, Black History Month. I'm always so happy when I do this. I've been doing it for a few years now here. And each time I sort of scratch into Black history, I'm just inspired by the dignity and the resilience and the strength, the courage of so many people. But it wasn't all nonfiction. I don't know. I think I have a pretty good smattering here. It's probably most dominantly nonfiction, but I still have lots of good recommendations for fiction. And I would recommend, do this throughout the year. You don't have to wait for Black History Month to roll around. So the first one actually isn't showing up because I got it from the library and it was a fast read, so it had to be returned within the first week. It was the Heaven and Earth grocery store. I think I rated it at 3 stars. I wasn't terribly impressed with it. I had higher hopes for it because it was recommended by the Oprah Book Club, which I don't put too much stock in that. I think our reading tastes are quite divergent. But Obama had recommended it, and he usually hits the nail on the head. I really respect lots of his recommendations. He's got a broad taste. So anyway, the Heaven and Earth grocery store didn't really live up to those expectations, unfortunately. It was basically about this gentrifying community, very strong African American and Jewish immigrant community. And it's gentrifying, so the Jews are moving out. And except for this one main family who runs the Heaven and Earth grocery store. And I don't want to give you any spoilers. And of course, if I give you the synopsis on all these, then this will be like 5 hours long. It's a story of resilience. It's a fiction. While it's a fiction, it's got lots of attitudes and norms of the time that it taps into really well. Jim McBride, or James McBride, I think was his name. He's a very florid writer. I would give him that. That's about the best I can say for this book anyway. I haven't read much of him. I think this is the only book that I've read of his. And while I would say he has literary flair, and I respect his actual ability to write, there were a few problems with this novel. I think it didn't really grab me. And there's some continuity issues. The main sort of opening scene doesn't really get resolved. It's not like this golden thread running through the book, you know what I mean? So you kind of like, oh yeah, what happened there? I know it does resolve it, but you're just kind of, it doesn't stand out. And there were other issues, but good writer though. Moving right along, I also read Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. Let's get a good look up there. And this was amazing. Let's see what I rated it on Goodreads as 5 stars. Yeah, I would say if I didn't give it a full 5 stars, it would be, 4 point something, rounding up to 5. Nonfiction, obviously, New York Times bestseller. It's a National Book Award winner. Ibram Kendi, I think he's like 41 now. I looked that up recently. So that means he would have been right around my age when he wrote this. And I mean, it's not a tome necessarily, but it's approaching tome length, before the notes here at about 515 pages. So, quite dense, and, it's just loaded with information, sizable pages. I really enjoyed it. It talks basically about the definitive history of racist ideas in America. Kind of explains, obviously in a dignified way. I mean, he's Black himself. He explains how just about everybody, up until maybe 30 years ago, and even many people now, Black members who purport to represent the Black community, are beholden to some very racist ideas and holdovers from our colonial history. Nowadays, you have to go to people like Thomas Sowell, Clarence Thomas, Candace Owens, even Denzel Washington, and sort of the pop culture. These are the people that are still promoting this Black racial uplift suasion, which is a profoundly racist doctrine and movement that, as you can see, it still goes on today. But generally you're seeing that in kind of conservative circles, right? Black conservative circles. For the most part, people who align themselves with the Black struggle, they're more towards the anti-racist ideology, which I think is in tune with natural justice and then, objectively moral way of looking at race. How, we sort of learned, especially coming out of Jim Crow, with mass incarceration and so on, we learned how colorblindness, what we learned from that was that unless you see me in my skin color, you're not really seeing me. And so while colorblindness seemed to sort of have this, what would you call, sort of a flavor of anti-racism, it was, this seemed like, we're on the right track. You can't just not notice somebody's color. If justice is your goal, you have to see the person with their history, with their color, and acknowledge their lived experience. And colorblindness has actually harmed a lot of people, even though it seemed at the time, certainly coming out of Jim Crow, if we just have procedural equality, that is, policies that treat everybody absolutely equally, that still harms people because you have so much systemic colonial baggage that people, they tarry on intergenerationally, and it does nothing about addressing implicit racial biases and things like that. So we needed a new paradigm, and Ibram Kendi really articulates that well. I gotta sort of attenuate what I say here because I don't want this to be a 5-hour video. Moving right along, we've got we've got a fiction here by Colson Whitehead, The Underground Railroad. Of the two Colson Whitehead novels that I read this month, I would say this was certainly much better than the other one. What I really liked about this, and he's kind of like James McBride in that sense, that he's got flair, he's got, I don't know if I would say he has florid writing, but he does have literary, what would I say, literary propensities, if you will. What caught me about this book most, I would say, is, as you can tell by that cover, The Underground Railroad, he's sort of doing an alternative history, if you can call it that. Instead of using the Underground Railroad as a metaphor, he's speaking more literally, and so you kind of go on this, I've called it in other videos like a Lewis and Clark sort of odyssey, on all these old trolley lines and things like that, abandoned trolley lines, and I really liked how he took that in a literal direction. He also channels a lot of Jonathan Swift in here. He even mentions that, I think, twice, and then once in the flap. So, you definitely got to keep your eye open for this. He flags it as, the main character, what was her name? Cora. Anyway, Cora, she sort of goes throughout the South, and while it is very true to the attitudes that prevailed at the time, she kind of creates this otherworldliness about it. Not exactly historically accurate for the circumstances she finds herself in, but the attitudes she's around, that part is very historical. So I liked that, and I think that because I had read Swift's Gulliver's Travels, I think a few years ago, it's still sort of fresh in my mind. What Swift was doing, if any of you have read Jonathan Swift, he was very dim. He had a very dim view of humanity. And he had to kind of create these other worlds to drive his point home of just how ridiculous and crazy humanity is, and not to delude yourself about the better angels of our nature, if you will. And Colson Whitehead, while he's not quite as dark as that, I think what his point was something along the lines of, you don't really have to make a fantasy out of Black history. If you could sort of imagine a parallel universe, it's still just as horrible. There is no real more horrible reality than what happened, even though he sort of sets up these more fantastical sort of plot lines and took, the Underground Railroad more literally. I would recommend this. I think this came in at 4 stars, I would say, and I probably rounded up to it. It didn't knock my socks off, but it was better than the Heaven and Earth grocery store, in my opinion. The next one is 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. It was part of this box set here in their own voices, first-hand histories of formerly enslaved people. So I had told you in other videos about the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and that's actually included in that box set if you go out and buy it. And I had read that a few months ago, and it destroyed me. I mean, Frederick Douglass is such an incredible guy, and what he had been through is just devastating. And then you pick up this book. This guy was free to begin with, and he had a family. He had 2 kids, I think. He was caught by slave catchers and drugged and swindled into slavery. And he just goes through 12 years of utter turmoil. Very similar to the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. I would say even probably a little more brutal. Not for the faint of heart, but so worth it. It's like reading Holocaust literature, some of this stuff. Next book is Jacqueline Woodson's Red at the Bone. This was good too. I would recommend it. I think I liked it better than the other 2 fictions I mentioned. This came out at 3 stars for me. Probably rounded down for that. Maybe it was like around 3.4, something like that. It's a National Book Award winning and New York Times bestselling author. In fact, was this the one she had like dozens of other books, I think? Yeah, she said, is the best-selling author of more than 24 award-winning books, including the 2016 New York Times best-selling National Book Award finalist for adult fiction, which was Another Brooklyn. That was the other book. What I liked about it is one of the main characters was a descendant of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so you've got a lot of trappings of, again, Jim Crow history. It also, there's some sapphic elements to this book, a little bit of LGBTQ theme coming up, and also a modern family sort of exploration into, gender roles and race and all that sort of thing. So if I say any more than that, I'll probably spoil it. I don't want to say much more than that. So just stay tuned for the book review on that, which will be coming up within several weeks. This is the other Colson Whitehead book that I was talking about, Crook Manifesto. This actually just came out last year, within a year. So it was 2023 some point. And the Underground Railroad that I had mentioned earlier, I think that was from 2016, and it was in Oprah's, book choice. And I'm sure even Obama recommended that. I think he even recommended this. It's a Harlem story. It's, sort of through the 70s, like from 71 to 76, I believe. And it was okay. I had mentioned in the review, which is to be released here in a few weeks, I wasn't really in the best place for reading through a few days there. There's just sort of a lot going on in my life. And everything is fine. It's just couldn't really settle into a book. Do you ever have that? I don't know. Maybe that was an unfair... I didn't tell you the rating yet, did I? The rating is probably unfair because Colson Whitehead does have a lot of following and people speak especially high of his writing. So I put this at 2 stars. I don't know. Maybe that's me. I did hear from other people, like on Booktube, that his character development was abnormally done well. Not abnormal for Colson Whitehead, just, as fictions go. So, and I would have to agree, there was a lot of gray area, a lot of backstory that was interesting, but it didn't really grab me, so I wouldn't be the first book that I'd recommend. Next up, I managed to get one Indigenous voice in there, Jody Wilson-Raybould's True Reconciliation. I really, really liked this. I had known of Jody Wilson-Raybould, really accomplished lawyer, good writer. Historically, I think she is pretty unimpeachable. I mean, she's quite academic, so she knows what she's doing. She knows how to, and she does cite a lot of her sources. In fact, what's really useful throughout this book, if all you can do, if you're one who doesn't read, books all the way through, I would just recommend read this gray part. This is sort of, see how that's a little grayer there? She goes on about a 90-page, about 90 pages worth of history, just explaining, this is our story. What is the sort of undercurrent in the Indigenous community that is sort of shorthand? Everybody knows basically what's happened throughout history, and it's that. So if that's all you can read out of this, I would recommend it for that alone. But it talks a lot about, how Canada can move in a direction of reconciliation and be part of the solution. Yes, there are problems with land back. There's problems with very collectivist reparations, sort of tort mentality towards historical wrongs. And I share that, by the way. I do share that we've got to take a little bit more of a sophisticated approach than just paying them for intergenerational traumas. Reparations is certainly a part of it, financial reparations, but everybody has to be signed on to this. That's where what I think is most important. Getting Indigenous voices more involved, keeping our commitments that we make to Indigenous communities, especially as it concerns title and rights. I can't recommend this enough. I think this did come out at 5 stars for me. No, it came out at 4. So I would have probably been rounding down to that. It was probably like 4.5 or 4.4. Next up is Harriet James' Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. So I had mentioned in the reviews of these books, which have already been recorded, how, I went from Frederick Douglass to Solomon Northup to Harriet Jacobs, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. Like what people went through was just unimaginable. And she makes a case in here that women, while they weren't put to perhaps quite as much physical labor, because, there were gender roles that were respected a little more back then, women did have it worse in other ways. Certainly when it comes to sexual exploitation. Lots of sort of stories like, Thomas Jefferson, for example, how he had a whole other line of offspring through Sally Hemings. The complicated relationships that emerge out of that, think about it. You've got a white family, and then with your essentially black concubine, you've got this other lineage. So what happens with those kids? Frequently they got sold into bondage. Lots of sexual exploitation with other males that have been living in the house. You couldn't be forward about, this is my other family. So you see your children being subjected to, subhuman treatment. She makes a really good point. I'd say the greatest argument she makes in there is that slavery has a way of not just corrupting the slave, but it especially corrupts the slaveholder, intellectually, morally, in every way, shape, and form. And they're really victimizing themselves. This was just such a devastating but inspiring account in equal measure, I would say. Again, not for the faint of heart, but man, if you can expose yourself to this sort of material, you won't regret it. I think you'll walk away with a much greater understanding of humanity. This is the next book up, The Underground Railroad, another book by that title, but this is the classic, written by William Still. What I would say, this is probably a microcosm of my reading this month. So this is all basically epistolary between William Still, who was a very prominent conductor in the Underground Railroad. They call them conductors. You see all of these letters from slaves that, were going through the Abolition Society and the Vigilance Committee, finding their freedom. And they kind of just blend together, so that's why it's sort of a microcosm of my reading here. You consume so much of this stuff that it's hard to remember, like, where did I read that? And what was that story? Was that story part of the fiction I read? But it's very worth it because, for example, that 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup, what you end up with is, sort of expanded version of what likely every letter writer in here was dealing with. I'm sure just about everyone in this book was very like Solomon Northup and what he had been through. It exposes you to all the little details that get lost to history, right? Not little for the people who are living it, not even remotely, but little in the sense that it doesn't get mentioned. So for example, like children getting sold out from under you, the friends you make in slavery and now you have to abandon them, especially if you've got family that you had to abandon to get freedom, thinking that, hey, with freedom, maybe I can bring them eventually up through the Underground Railroad to Canada. now you've lost your raison d'etre, you've lost your reason for being, until you're reunited. So lots of these people, they left slavery with unclosable wounds, and what are you supposed to do with your life now? And you also deal with guilt because they're still living in slavery and you've got your freedom. There's a lot of that sort of thing. Also the travails of the actual voyage itself, being locked in a crate for dozens of hours, and people being passed off as some sort of commercial good. There's one story where somebody sneezed or coughed while they were rolling the cart away, and so they managed to cover for the person, so that the person who is handling the crate didn't catch on. But lots of stories like that, the nitty-gritty details that just don't get brought up in regular conversation in speaking of Black history and slavery. So that was such a good book. Before I move on to the next one, I just wanted to get the rating for that. I think I put that at 4 stars. The only thing that I had against it is they all sort of blend together. And you don't want that when you're absorbing this sort of history, right? You want to know the individual stories, but there's just so much account of suffering. Next up is Transcendent Kingdom, a novel. This is probably my favorite novel for the month, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, I would say it's my favorite. It's written by a Ghanaian? A Ghanaian. Her name was Gyasi. What do I say about this without going into a long tangent? Maybe I'll just speak of the themes. So yes, you're dealing with an immigrant family. She comes, with her family quite young. Her parents, one of them deals really heavily with racism and has to leave. And there's, all kinds of abandonment issues. She loses her older brother to, I think that's even mentioned in the notes here, so it's not a spoiler. In fact, Gyasi mentions that in lots of interviews and press about this book, that her, the main character's older brother dies of addiction. She also deals with themes of religion because they're in a very, it's where she actually grew up, Huntsville, Alabama, the author, and that's where the story takes place. And so very strong, sort of evangelical or Baptist, I can't really remember, Pentecostal, one of those upbringings, and sort of shows all the institutional racism within the church, but also what the church meant to her, the main character. And she's obviously going down a different road because she's studying addiction in school. She's actually working towards her doctorate, and so she's conducting all these experiments on lab mice and trying to understand the reward pathways, neurologically speaking. And so of course that naturally brings up the question of God and the mind-body thing, like, is there any place for a belief in the soul, sort of thing. So she's dealing with all of that, and I especially related to it very well because of my background growing up as a Jehovah's Witness. I still contend with this, like, how do we keep what little baby there is in the bathwater? I don't want to be entirely dismissive of religious belief and certainly religious tradition and ceremony and archetype and all the rest of it. But at the same time, we do have to dispense with a lot, especially as we become a more scientific species. So I really related to this. I would say this is definitely my favorite novel of the month. Strongly recommended. I think I did put that at a full 5 stars. I probably would have given it 6 if I could. The next up is Caste, written by Isabel Wilkerson. Might as well give you a chance to look at it. I would say this gets another full 5 stars, nonfiction, obviously. And it's, I would say it's a psycho-anthropological look at race in America, compares it to the caste system in India, and shows, very much, the commonalities between the untouchables there. She even refers to this anecdote involving Martin Luther King, where he visited India, and he was at some colloquium and was introduced as an untouchable. He recoiled from that at first, he was like, I'm not an untouchable, like, that's a horrible thing to say, but he says, the more he looked into it and the more he thought about it, that's exactly what the black caste race is in America, and continues to be even since Martin Luther King, especially with the rise of incarceration rates and economic segregation and all the rest of it. What I appreciated most, I would say, and she opens up with this, is how caste works. It's not accurate to say that, to call it just a class distinction or a race distinction. That's perhaps the methodology of how caste is applied. But she says caste is much more subtle. Caste is like an unwritten grammar in culture. Those who speak English natively, we would know just inherently about adjective order, for example. That you would say the quality of something first before you say, the other characteristics like the color and the size and the age and so on. You would put that in a particular order, and somebody who isn't even taught that, is just taught sort of through osmosis, to refer to, that item over there as the brown leather chair. You wouldn't call it like the chair that's leather and brown, like there's an order of adjectives. And you notice that when non-native speakers come in and they sort of jumble it up, they know that that the noun and the adjective should come at different places in the sentence, but they don't know how to order the adjectives. And so her point is that caste works very similarly. You don't need to have written rules of engagement, and that is something that's learned. It's sort of like through osmosis. And so she says how blacks are treated in particular relative to other races in America, they're at the bottom rung. And so she argues that really well, and something that I hadn't, an angle that I hadn't really thought of in too much length before. So I'd highly recommend this as well. This, as I say, was another 5-star for me. Moving right along, I think this next one is a 4-star, is what I put it at. I would say I probably rounded down on it. It's getting to be a little dated. It's called The New Jim Crow, subtitled Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. So I really wish, in fact, if you know of any books that are more updated than this, I think this was written around 2010 and then re-released around 2012 with a different intro or forward. If you know of any other book that was written more recently, I would say since 2020, that looks specifically at mass incarceration, that would be awesome. I would love to read it. But in the absence of that, The New Jim Crow was a New York Times bestseller and really heavily statistical, and talks about not just mass incarceration, just at the intergenerational traumas that have plagued the black community since slavery and Jim Crow, and how other politicians that otherwise should be acting in the better interests of the black community, such as certainly Obama and even Clinton, who is sort of dubbed the first black president, did a lot of things that sold the African American community out. And her argument towards the end, while this only represents about 10 pages, I would say, her argument is that don't let the appearance of more black politicians or people in power deceive you about the undercurrent of racism that is very healthy and thriving. The more things change, the more things stay the same. That's how she opens up the book. But at the very end, she's arguing that, Obama, while it was probably a good thing that he was a president and pointed to much of the improvements that had been made over time. Oftentimes what happens is, these black politicians who, did have a lot of privilege in their life and do attain higher status, they're still amenable to much of the racist forces that still hold sway. And so they will be willing, for the sake of, power or whatever other less than honorable motivation, to sell out their race and, worsen the mass incarceration problem. And so that was kind of news to me, where I kind of docked her a few points. I still put this at 4.5 stars. Where I would dock her is she was very vague, in my opinion, about her recommendations for moving forward towards something like anti-racism or post-racialism. But I mean, this is kind of petty differences, nothing worth arguing about too extensively. I still think she did a really, really good job of this. It's too bad that it's getting dated now. I know some of the statistics have improved in some ways, some of them have gotten worse. But Michele Alexander, she's here's a little background on her. She's a brilliant lawyer. She was even a clerk for Harry A. Blackman, who I think retired in like 1997, something like that. So she's been around for a while. Brilliant legal mind. You don't get a clerkship. They don't just hand that out to anybody. Those are some of the most sought after jobs in the country. And she's worked for the ACLU, and this is her bestseller. I think it's her first book, so she got it right the first time. She's a public speaker. I don't think she's working in law so much now. She's mainly on the lecture circuit. But if you get a chance to read this, I would recommend it. It's really informative stuff. Then moving on to more from that In Their Own Voices box set. This is Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, who, we were talking earlier about, racial uplift suasion and some very racist ideas that even, I would say most, if not all people from that era subscribed to, even blacks. He was... there's a lot of good things to say about Booker T. Washington. Obviously, he's earned his place in history and in that box set. But, he was the voice of uplift suasion, which was, it definitely harmed the black community in many ways. For those of you who don't know what uplift suasion is, it's kind of like if black people just behaved better, then, they will be given their due, and they'll just eventually culture will award them with more power and better outcomes, more economic opportunities and all the rest of it. I kind of liken this to some of the New Age prosperity gospeling, not quite, but there's a little bit of that in there where it's like, don't be a victim, buck up and take on your suffering, sort of Jordan Peterson like. And I think that if for those who have the circumstances, that's a wonderful message. But for those who simply, you can't, for example, how do you tell a Palestinian who, is getting carpet bombed, well, if you just vibe right, things are going to get better. I find it kind of falls flat like that, right? For those who do have the circumstances, like Booker T. Washington, I mean, he really made the most of it. And look at what he did. He built that Tuskegee University, which is still operating today. He accomplished some incredible things. So don't sell that sort of thing short. But at the same time, you still have to have a lot of ducks in a row and a lot of antecedent immunities just to be able to make the most of it, right? So that's where I think that became harmful. Still a really good book, kind of like I would say lots of self-help stuff in there, sort of Dale Carnegie type things. That is always of value. But I found that because so many people have exploited that message, nothing against Booker T. Washington, but because people have exploited it, I had to dock him some points because it's a little bit out of touch. It's actually quite a bit out of touch, and W.E.B. Du Bois would agree with me on that. Moving on, this was not in the box set, but it's an Arcturus classic. It's called The Autobiography of a Female Slave, written by Martha Griffith Browne. Now, it sounds like an autobiography by the main character, who's Anne, but there's some sort of historicity issues with this book. I think she even suffered a lot of rejection with this book when it first came out. Martha Griffith Browne was actually white, so calling it an autobiography was something of a misnomer, obviously. And by the white community at the time, it was dismissed, but it was really persuasive and had quite a life, took on a life of its own in abolitionist circles at the time. I'm talking around the time of Harriet Beecher Stowe with Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was sort of concurrent with that, around the same time. and the Civil War. So, but very, very heartbreaking story. You get a sense of the brutality and the exploitation. Many Southern plantation owners would just, they would make false promises to their slaves. And, their slaves put their all into, trying to free themselves and sometimes others. And then just for the slave owner to turn around and be like, no, we never had that agreement. Or, say, you're black, you don't have this entitlement coming towards you. You should just be happy for basically the privilege of serving me and that sort of thing. Again, I just can't say how valuable this stuff is. Now on to the last book. By the way, I think I put that at 5 stars, not for the historicity debate. I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but the story just stands on its own. And if it's good enough for the abolitionists, it's good enough for me. That's what I say. Okay, another 5-star. This was Our Hidden Conversations, written by Michele Norris. This was such a good read. It's kind of textbook format here. Really well illustrated. She's the leader of, it's called the Race Card Project. And the Race Card Project is really neat. So it started out, I think, back in like 2012 or something. It was just a postcard. People were invited to send in 6 words on race. And then there was another box to maybe add a little bit of context, what you meant by those words. And the stories, their lived experience. And you even got a lot of white people writing in saying, I'm not racist just because I'm white. Or those sort of, I would say, tone-deaf arguments that somehow misunderstanding how blacks are, speaking about systemic issues that were started very much by and for the white race. It wasn't the blacks who started this. It wasn't the African Americans who started this issue. It started off explicitly as a European design with race in mind to keep blacks at the bottom of the caste system. And so now that it's been formulated that way, for blacks to turn around and say, this is the history we're dealing with, so race very much does matter. The color of your skin matters in so much as it's responsible for the systemic institutional plight that we've seen and the intergenerational traumas. That's where the color matters. It doesn't matter in the sense that, oh, well, you're white, you're racist. That's not what they're saying. But still, because this is like open to anybody to write in, and even I wrote in once I learned of this. Actually, I read through the book and I wrote my own 6 words that I'll tell you at the end. But, you get a lot of this sort of thing like, prayed God would make me white. So you got this double consciousness by a lot of black people or people of a different, race, not necessarily black. Tired of dream, where is plan? Please explain race to a blind girl. Always under the skin of America. Just looking at one small box here. I'm white and pay the price. And this guy had told about how he's been, because of affirmative action, he can't get a job. And he doesn't have any quote unquote race issues. I don't know him, but I'm taking his word for what it is. It just gives you a tour d'horizon, or like a broad survey of what people are thinking of. And this has gotten such great participation by so many people. Other ones are more prosaic, sort of like you need the anecdote to back it up. Like, today I applied for a passport. Okay, so there's more to that story. But my granny said no white girls. Busing, white girl, black schools, lonely. It's just such a healthy read. And I walked away kind of like, feeling like Bruce Almighty, like I had read everybody's prayers, Now, my 6 words, I have to try to remember this, but I put a lot of thought into it. It was diversity, semicolon, audacious, expensive, deadly, ... worth it, exclamation mark. That's my 6 words. Now, a little context for that is, what I mean is, if we're going to aim up and be a society that is by and for everybody, there is really no loftier vision than that. But it's lofty because precisely because it is so hard, and obviously I don't have to worry about my race. It's not defined my life in any way. Now let me explain just extremely briefly what I mean by that. I know, both on an unconscious and a conscious level, that I can count on white solidarity. In other words, I don't have to leave a bad situation or a bad encounter with somebody and ask myself, did they treat me that way because I'm not white? That's what I'm referring to. But for many people in their lived experience, it has. And so, I don't have to contend with that. But I can imagine for those who do, it's extremely debilitating, or, even just knowing that you had a grandmother that was a slave at one time. I mean, that would get to your psychology, I think. It would certainly get to me. While the United States in particular has such a ferment surrounding race and such a terrible history, if we're going to aim up and become a diverse society, it's obviously going to entail, even for places where they haven't been affected quite like America has, it's still going to be something that you have to work at. I mean, for example, I'm a man and, I'm with a woman. I can't see things from a woman's perspective all the time. I'm the center of my universe. She's the center of hers, right? So, of course, I'm going to be looking through the eyes of a man on certain things. I can try my best to understand, but there's going to be moments where I don't get it right. Well, how do you handle that? Does that naturally make me misogynistic or patriarchal or whatever? You have to work at it. And just because you lost sight of it at times doesn't mean that you're irredeemable. And same goes with the other, with those in relationships with the other gender is involved, right? And so race is very much the same way. I will never understand what it's like to deal with the intergenerational trauma and economic disparities and mass incarceration issues and all the rest of it that plague the African American community. I won't understand that. I haven't been through it, and I will lose sight of it because I'm the center of my universe. But I can be very conscious going into dealing with people of other races and be attuned to their lived experience. And I think that's what this book is trying to say, and that's certainly what my 6 words is about, is if we're going to be a diverse society, if this is how we're going to aim up and this is how we're going to define ourselves, then naturally there's going to be issues. The issues is the point. Yes, it's expensive. It takes courage. It takes bravery. It's audacious. It's an audacious enterprise. It's even deadly. Certainly in the American experiment, it's been a deadly thing, race has. But it is worth it. I mean, otherwise you get a whole bunch of white people sitting in a room huffing their own farts. That's how it goes. That's not healthy for anybody. That's not healthy for any society to be insular like that. So if we're going to go forward, it's best to embrace it. And these problems are just a matter of fact for that lofty ideal. So just to go through them again, I would say Our Hidden Conversations, Autobiography of a Female Slave, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, 12 Years a Slave, and Stamped from the Beginning. Those were my 5-star books. So, if you have the opportunity to read these, I would highly recommend it. If you had any books that you read through Black History, well, I would just love to hear from you whether you followed that or not. What was your reading like through February? I'd love to hear from you in the comments. We'll see you down there. Thanks for stopping by. Hey everyone, I hope you liked this video. If you want more like the one you just watched, click the suggested video on this screen. Make sure you subscribe, and to connect with me on my other platforms, my handles are linked below in the description, alright? Take care, peeps. Till next time.